Welcome back everyone to our studies in AQA A-level history. In this video we're going to spend some time talking about foreign relations during the so-called affluent society between 1951 and 1964. Now there's quite a few points that we can really examine here because of course this is the beginning stages of the Cold War as well as the beginning stages of the decolonisation process. So as the Cold War is ramping up, we also see the British Empire starting to fade at the same time. So we'll examine the relationships with Europe and the sort of early embryonic stage of the European Economic Community, which eventually turns into the European Union. We'll talk about relations and policies towards the USA and the USSR. We'll talk about the idea of the Cold War and nuclear deterrence before thinking about some of the issues that were directly concerned by the British, so the Suez crisis, the winds of change and decolonisation, as well as the Korean War. So our conversation should probably begin by thinking about relationships with Europe. In 1959, after World War II, European integration became one of those significant parts of the continent's reconstruction. We can see that the establishment by the Treaty of Rome in 1957 of the European Economic Community aimed to create a common market and a customs union between 6 founding members. These 6 founding members were Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. The aim really essentially was this idea that if we were to link our economies together, then it would make war with each other far more difficult, given that our economies are now governed by a supranational institution, an institution that sits beyond that of just the individual member states. That's the whole point of the European Union. And then from there, we have seen the European Union develop further and further and further into a deeper and deeper, more deeply integrated economic community in which we can see the free movement of people, free movement of goods, something called the single market, a common currency also established by the European Union. This begins very, very small. It actually begins by a deal of coal and steel industries, or coal and iron industries. The idea being that if we link our heavy industries together, then that makes war, which requires these heavy industries, far more difficult to achieve as well, to actually make happen, shall I say. At the time, in 1959, Britain was hesitant to join the EEC. This is partially due to its desire to maintain autonomy over its foreign policy and economic interests, and also because of its relationship with the Commonwealth and the slowly decolonising period of the British Empire. They still had control over some of their territories. Some of the most important of their territories under the British Empire, though, had been essentially made independent or had declared independence. India and Pakistan, for example, their establishment was in 1947. Now, ultimately then, what we see is that Britain initially sought to create a free trade area with European nations, but tried to do so outside of the framework of the EEC, of the European Community. And so in 1959, we see the creation of, by Great Britain, the European Free Trade Association, the EFTA. This is done alongside Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland. It's an alternative to the EEC, and it was designed to promote free trade between its members without the idea of political integration or the quite extensive economic rules that existed within the EEC. However, the EFTA, the Free Trade Agreement, did not have the same kind of economic dynamism as the EEC. It was just a sort of loose economic grouping, and its members faced a number of limitations in competing with integrated economies that existed in the EEC. And so the idea of the EFTA does slowly fade into obscurity, and we start to see attempts by Britain to join the EEC. So the first attempt and the first application to join the EEC was in 1961 under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Influenced by economic pressures and the decline of the British Empire, as well as the need for greater access to European markets, we see the application be sent to try and join the EEC. Now, initially, Macmillan's government was hopeful about joining, seeing it as a necessary step for the UK's future. But the application was rejected in 1963 by the French president at the time, who was Charles de Gaulle, who vetoed it due to his belief that Britain's interests did not align with the interests of the EEC, and also feared that the UK's relationship with the United States would undermine the unity of the European project. And so, the failure to join the EEC was a significant post-war moment in terms of British foreign policy, and it would not result in the actual joining of the EEC until much later on, which we will get to in a future lesson. More specifically then, throughout this period, the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States remained a cornerstone, but it was marked by both collaboration and tension. In terms of sort of broad collaboration, we can see that between 1950 and 1953, we see the Korean War. It had a significant impact on Anglo-American relations. In 1950, the North Korean invasion of South Korea triggered a United Nations intervention, which was led by the United States. Now, under the prime ministers of Winston Churchill and then later Anthony Eden, who was also the foreign secretary under Winston Churchill, we see that Britain supported the US and also contributed troops to the conflict. The war itself highlighted the British commitment to collective security of the Western Bloc and also the British commitment to the Cold War goals of containment. And the problem with it was, of course, that it ultimately strained to a lesser extent the British economy, given the significant military expenses involved, but it remained a major impact in terms of the relationship between the US and the United Kingdom. A far more controversial event which takes place in 1956 that sees the tension between the US and the UK and a tension between and a straining of the special relationship was the 1956 Suez crisis. It was a major turning point in Anglo-American relations. So essentially, after the end of the Second World War, the monarchy in Egypt, the Egyptian leader at the time, was deposed in a military coup and was replaced by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, in 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is, of course, a vital trading route that had been operated by a company which was run by the British and the French. And Nasser decided to nationalise it. He wanted to take control of the Suez Canal. And in response, Britain, France and Israel, the three countries, launched a military intervention to try and seize control of the Suez Canal. The British and the French were motivated by the desire to maintain control of the Suez Canal and to sort of exert their imperial influence one last time. And Israel was motivated by the sense of trying to achieve international legitimacy. Don't forget, Israel had only come into existence in 1948 and was still in a period of quite substantial hostility with Egypt and with Lebanon and with Jordan and with Iraq and with Syria. So the position of Israel was to try and strengthen her position with imperial powers, and that's why she involved herself in the conflict as well. Now, the United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, strongly opposed the British and French action, partly because of Cold War concerns. Essentially, the Arab world, the Arab nations, including Egypt and including Lebanon and Jordan and Syria and all these different countries, mostly remained part of what was known as the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. So you sort of had aligned states that were aligned to either the Soviet Union or the United States. And then you had what was known as a non-aligned movement that was sort of broadly neutral in the matters of the Cold War. And major countries involved in the non-aligned movement included the former Yugoslavia and also the state of Egypt. Now, while they remained non-aligned, quote-unquote, they still did often, more so than not, align with the Soviet Union over the United States, such as Egypt and Yugoslavia. But ultimately, Dwight D. Eisenhower at the time did not want these on their face neutral countries to fall under the Soviet umbrella of influence, and also Eisenhower did not want a major regional conflict to conflict with his desire for re-election in the November 1956 presidential elections, which took place, which were around the same time. And so Eisenhower strongly opposed the action. His condemnation of the invasion and his insistence on a ceasefire highlighted the changing power dynamics in international relations. The response by the British and the French to withdraw from the Suez Canal represented what would probably be described as the final dying breath of the British Empire, and ultimately forces the resignation of the Prime Minister at the time, Anthony Eden, the former Foreign Secretary. We also see that the US is a critical partner in Britain's development of nuclear weapons. They closely worked and cooperated on the nuclear deterrent, with the US sharing atomic secrets with Britain in both the 40s and the 50s. By the early 1960s, however, there were tensions over Britain's nuclear policy. The United States sought to maintain control over its own nuclear arsenal. The US was also concerned that Britain's nuclear ambitions could affect the United Defence Strategy under NATO, which had been established in 1949. But ultimately, these kinds of tensions did not come with the same kind of venom and the same kind of clearly open hostilities as the Suez Crisis had in 1956. When it comes to the relationship between the UK and the Soviet Union during this time, we see that Britain's relationship with the USSR is shaped by the broader context of the Cold War. We can see that ultimately the 1950s sees the heightened tension between the Soviets in the East and the capitalist countries in the West. Britain is a key member of NATO, and Britain is a staunch ally of the US in the struggle against communism. We can see that Winston Churchill famously warned of a, quote, Iron Curtain descending across Europe, and that the UK follow US policy by supporting NATO and the containment of communism. He made this speech about the Iron Curtain when he was out of office, when Anthony Eden was in office. Furthermore, we can see that in 1956, the Hungarian uprising was a major defining moment in Anglo-Soviet relations. When Soviet forces ultimately crushed a popular revolt in Hungary, Britain, like much of the West, would condemn the Soviet Union's actions. They were unable to intervene militarily, of course, again reflecting its diminished power in the Cold War, but also most countries didn't intervene in the Hungarian uprising due to the context of the Cold War and the kind of catastrophe that might have sparked as a result. And then finally, by 1962, we can see that the Cuban Missile Crisis brings Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union onto the brink of nuclear conflict. Now, although Britain was not a central actor in the crisis, you won't hear much conversation about the British role during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're talking about a relationship between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy at this time. They still nevertheless supported the US stance and were also involved in NATO deliberations during the event and ultimately after the event. The development and maintenance then of the nuclear deterrent, as we mentioned earlier on, as I mentioned when I talked about the US-UK relationship, was of course a major issue in post-war foreign policy. But what was also a very, very important issue in post-war foreign policy was, of course, the establishment of their own nuclear weapons program. Their successful test of a nuclear bomb took place in 1952, and the British government under Churchill and Macmillan believed that a nuclear deterrent was essential for Britain's security and their prestige, and also put the United Kingdom on the map in a world that at the moment was dominated by the US and the USSR's power relationship in what is known as a bipolar world. The idea of bipolarity is this idea that you have two major points of geopolitical power that are often in contrast with each other. In the Cold War, this was the US and the USSR. And so Britain sought to try and put herself onto that international stage, and the nuclear weapon and the British independence nuclear deterrent was one such method for doing so. Finally then, let's talk about the end of the empire, the establishment of the decolonisation process. We can see that from the period of 1951 to 1964, even earlier if you will, 1945 to 1964, we see the beginning of the end of the British Empire as decolonisation rapidly accelerates. 1956 was arguably the last point at which we can see the last final dying breath of the British Empire with the Suez crisis. And additionally, in 1957, we could see that the Prime Minister at the time, who had just replaced Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, famously delivers his Winds of Change speech. This was in South Africa, and it signalled a major shift in British policy towards the colonies. The speech acknowledged the growing momentum for independence across the African continent, as more and more colonies were beginning to demand self-rule, and if you are somebody who is interested in thinking about decolonisation more specifically, we have a series of lessons looking at the British Empire's topic for A-level history. Now, if you're studying Making of Modern Britain, this module, you will not be studying that one. But if you're interested in having a little look, you might want to see what it's like. Ultimately, there are... I will talk about some of these examples here, but ultimately there is a sort of a back and forth in terms of decolonisation for the British. The French approach to decolonisation was to try and crack down and hold on to their colonial subjects as much as possible. We see that in Vietnam. We also see that in French Algeria. The British was a little bit more peaceful than that. There were examples where the British definitely did just get independence or leave certain areas and allow the colonies to begin to rule themselves. But that's not to suggest that British decolonisation was a bloodless event. It was still something that had quite a lot of violence as a result, which we'll get to in a second. And so Macmillan's recognition then, this winds of change idea, and the recognition from the British Prime Minister of self-rule was something that marked the beginning of a more sympathetic stance towards decolonisation. So prior to some of the decolonisation, to the Winds of Change speech, some of the decolonisation ideas were quite violently repressed, and we'll talk about that briefly in a second. But ultimately, the speech underscores Britain's declining influence as the empire was being rapidly dismantled. And we can see that decolonisation takes place in a number of different areas. In 1957, Ghana was the first African colony to achieve its independence, setting a precedent for the rest of the continent. Other African nations followed in the 1960s: Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Uganda. Kenya gained its independence in 1963 following the brutal Mau Mau uprising and the subsequent negotiations as a result. In terms of within the Middle East, we can see that in 1948, slightly before our period of study, we see that the British leaves the mandate areas. Essentially, the mandates was a system that was established under the League of Nations prior to the Second World War, and it was sort of seen as a type of colonization process in which the eventual end result is self-governance of the native peoples of those regions. Now, that would sort of suggest that it is sort of a lesser form of colonization, but it had quite a lot of the same ideas relating to colonization. The most famous of these mandates, of course, is the British Mandate for Palestine, which, when the British left the Palestinian region in the British Mandate in May 1948, the Declaration of Independence of Israel takes place, and that causes a war for independence for the Israelis, and we see a lot of events taking place that are partially the fault of the British, ultimately. The British were also, of course, forced to withdraw from Suez in 1956 following the Suez crisis, signifying the end of the British influence in the Middle East. And so the end of empire really does take place following the Suez crisis and following Kenya's independence, and slowly we see more and more independent states taking place. India gains its independence in 1947. In 1964, like I just said, British colonies in Africa win their independence. And Britain's decline as a global power then has major implications for her foreign policy, because it leads to a shift in the terms of focus away from thinking about the British in terms of its imperial status towards thinking more in relation to NATO and Europe, and also to the Commonwealth, the sort of lasting legacy of Britain's control over some of these former territories.